Welcome back to the show, everyone. I am your host, Holly, and this is my second time recording this podcast episode. So we're going to hope that Zoom, the internet, my microphone, the universe, the internet gods all cooperate this time around because I got about 45 minutes into it last time. A contractor at my house flipped our switch and our Wi-Fi went out for a second and then no audio saved. And I was really proud of that episode. And that was not the first time that had happened that week. So I'm really hoping this goes better and that the odds are in my favor because I'm really excited about this topic and this pod episode because I think it's going to help a lot of you. I think a lot of the times when we get clients working with us, me and Erica over at Hollyfield Nutrition, when I hear from you guys on the internet, a lot of the issues we're trying to help you with come back to the gut, comes back to GI symptoms. So today we're going to go over basically the top causes and the top things to address that we see in practice when it comes to GI issues in runners. And then I'm also going to touch on a recent study that came out this year that basically connected a correlation between distance running and an increased risk of colon cancer. A lot of people have sent this to me and asked me about it, so I definitely wanted to address my thoughts on it, just with what we have about this information preliminarily, because it's obviously super interesting and very much has to do with the population that is listening to this podcast. So let's first start with because I think the first part of this podcast episode will give you a lot of context to how I approach looking at this study. Okay, so let's go into the top causes for digestive issues in runners. And of course, I'm a dietitian. These are things I've observed with my own clients, but this podcast episode is not a replacement for individualized medical advice. It doesn't constitute a relationship with a dietitian or a medical provider. You should run any questions you have that this brings up by your own healthcare team. Or, of course, I'd be happy to support you as your provider as well through working together with additional services that I will link in the show notes and describe along the way. Because podcasts and social media are not the same thing as working with a practitioner, but the hope is usually that they will allow you to reflect on maybe some questions or symptoms or highlight some things that you can bring up with your own team. And I think that can be really valuable and helpful. So, the first one, there is I guess a saying that I learned from a mentor who I think she learned it from a mentor who I think learned it from a mentor. So I don't claim any ownership over this saying, but I really like it. Is that in the health and wellness space, when we hear hoofbeats, we should think of and expect horses and not zebras and unicorns. So, what I mean by that is when we see symptoms or writing on the wall, we should expect it to be something more typical, covering the basics, and not some crazy, outlandish, very rare, complicated medical condition. I think a lot of the times it's very human to think we're a special case. We're very unique. These symptoms, nobody else could possibly be experiencing this, and it has to be a complicated answer. And I'm here to tell you that the good news is a lot of the times when we hear hoofbeats, it's horses and it's not zebras and unicorns. Of course, I don't want to gaslight people who do have rare conditions and have been through the ringer trying to get the support that they deserve. I work with a lot of these clients. And we want to cover the basics first. So we're going to kind of move up the spectrum of the weeds and more complicated things that I see when it comes to GI issues and gut health in runners. But we're going to start with the basics because this one's super common, probably the most common, and very important to cover. And that is dehydration. So, hydration status is going to make a big difference when it comes to GI issues. A lot of runners, if we're experiencing, diarrhea and urgency, especially during and after, especially if it's during the second half of a run or after or both, a lot of the times this can have to do with either a lack of adequate fluids and or lack of adequate electrolytes, especially sodium. Our losses of fluids and electrolytes, especially sodium, while we sweat are quite high. And this is going to vary a lot based on genetics. Some people are going to be more prone to symptoms if they are heavier sweaters, have higher electrolyte losses in their sweat, aka salty sweaters. They're going to be more prone to these things, especially if we're talking about like more extreme hot conditions, more humid conditions. Altitude can affect this as well. But if you're someone who's not really a heavy sweater, you barely sweat, you just sparkle a little bit, when you're done with the run, and we all envy you. You never notice that you really have salt on your skin and you tolerate the heat really, really well. Congrats. Genetically, you're probably advantageous there, and maybe you're not a heavy sweater and you're not losing as much. You're still losing something, but not as much. So the reference ranges for making sure we're not dealing with dehydration are going to be very large. So when we think about hydration status, we want to think about a couple different things. We want to think about sodium. We want to think about fluid, and timing. So we want to address these things before, during, and after our workouts. I see if people habitually just aren't consuming like enough total water, like just total fluid throughout the day. A lot of the times they can struggle with more constipation because things just aren't really moving through as well. I also see, if there's lack of electrolytes, a lot of the times we can see the opposite. We can see some more diarrhea, which of course is going to exacerbate the problem because you're probably losing more electrolytes and fluid when you have diarrhea, than you can possibly take in. So the way to combat this is to really make sure that we are meeting the basic sports nutrition references for hydration. So during your runs, especially if they're an hour or longer, we really want to make sure we're getting in probably anywhere between like 10 and 30 ounces of water per hour. That's a huge range. It's going to vary a bit depending on weather, sweat rate, intensity, all of that good stuff. But we probably want at least 10 ounces of fluid per hour for most people. Anywhere up to like over, 30 ounces, which can be more extreme. And then sodium wise, we want at least 300 milligrams of sodium per hour, although what's more average is 1,000 milligrams of sodium per hour. If you identify as like a saltier sweater, you don't have good heat tolerance, you feel like you get GI distress during and after your runs a lot, you see a lot of like salt crusty, stuff on your skin, or on your clothes after you're done working out, your sweat like really, really burns your eyes right away. You're probably a salty sweater. You probably want to get at least 1,000 milligrams of sodium per hour or more. So this is really going to help prevent GI issues because essentially proper hydration status is everything. When we are consuming like fluid and electrolytes, the electrolytes do a couple different things. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but basically they hold either a positive or negative charge when combined with water. That's what constitutes an electrolyte. And the main ones are sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, bicarb, and magnesium. I don't think I said magnesium, but there are more too, but those are the biggest ones. And the ones we lose the most of in sweat are sodium, chloride, and also technically potassium. We do lose other things in sweat too, like iron, but sodium and chloride are like the biggest things that we lose in sweat. And depending on whether they have a positive or negative charge, kind of depends on what they do. But essentially, to think of it this way, if you have electrolytes in the system, the fluid's going to follow them. So if you have plenty of electrolytes, you're absorbing that fluid into your body. It's helping stabilize your blood volume. Those electrolytes are helping your muscles contract and relax properly. You're good to go. If you're consuming a lot of like plain water while you're running and you're not meeting the basic sports nutrition recommendations for sodium, 300 milligrams per hour, so to speak, that water essentially isn't going to get absorbed as well because there's no electrolytes for it to follow, and it's going to go through you. And that can cause diarrhea, sloshiness, and actually a little bit more dehydration because it can pull nutrients from your body. Vice versa, if we consume, a ton of sodium, but not enough fluid to kind of help balance it out, this is what I call jerkying yourself, where you're essentially drying yourself out because there's just not enough fluid to follow all of the sodium that you just took in. And the symptoms of dehydration, GI distress being one of them, are like also swollen fingers, cramping. Technically, we don't have a ton of evidence to like prove it's always hydration related, but I do see this clinically a lot. as part of the picture. And headaches, you stop sweating, you get cold, shivers, you feel like you're overheating can also be a side effect. GI distress, just feeling like you kind of have the flu the rest of the day. A lot of these symptoms are hydration related, and it can be not enough of fluid or electrolytes. It can be not enough electrolytes compared to fluid. It can be too many electrolytes compared to fluid. It can be too much fluid, not enough electrolytes. And it can be, an overconsumption of both, but that's a lot more rare because that's hard to physically do. And most people are underestimating their needs, I find, in practice. So we really want to make sure the hydration's going well, especially before, during, and after your activity. We don't want to forget about sodium. We don't want to be afraid of sodium. Sodium is going to help us, especially if you're feeling any of those symptoms, GI issues being one of them. Okay, kind of going up the chain of complexity here. The next top cause, root cause of GI issues in runners that I see all the time in practice is chronic underfueling. I think it's really hard for people to understand how this can affect your gut health and bring upon GI issues. So I'm gonna explain it for you. I have on previous podcast episodes with special guests like Kirsten Screen, but I want to go into it again because it's been a while. So essentially, when we are not eating enough total energy, we're not getting enough food in general, we're not giving our body the materials it needs to build its muscles back stronger, to make all of our body systems thrive and run really efficiently. Our body starts to conserve energy and kind of just get by. It does this in so many ways, which is why chronic underfueling that can turn into relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS, that you may have heard of, affects every body system. It's very systemic. It can kind of sneak up on you and be really hard for people to identify, because it's not always obvious. It's not always, I lost a bunch of weight, I got a stress fracture, I stopped performing well, my period's gone, and now I feel like crap. It can be those things, absolutely. But it can also look like GI issues, bloating, weight gain. You're having trouble performing well, even though you were performing well before. You've got some little injuries that keep popping up and have a hard time healing. You're not sleeping well, your sex drive is low, but you're still getting a period, or you're on birth control, so you can't tell if you're getting a period, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So not enough materials to have our body systems functioning optimally. Your GI system is massive. It takes up your entire torso. That is a huge chunk of real estate when it comes to your body systems that it takes up in your entire abdomen. So this system, I think a lot of the times we think of it as, hey, this system is for digesting things, absorbing things. We just take it for granted. It's just gonna work. We don't have to give it anything. It's functioning on its own. But your digestive system requires tissue repair. It requires, immune function, circulation, nutrients to keep itself running well, just like your muscles, your brain, your bones. It's like when you think of an insurance company and you think of, well, the insurance company provides people with insurance, right? Okay, but the employees who work at that insurance company, they also require insurance, right? So this is kind of like the GI system. Your GI system, yes, it absorbs nutrients, it, digests our food for us, but it also requires a lot of TLC to run and work efficiently. And we need to give it enough energy to do so. When we are underfueling, one of the first things to suffer is usually our reproductive systems, because your body's basically well, not a good time to, get pregnant or reproduce, because we can barely keep the lights on, and functioning well, just our own selves. So we have no business, adding another life to the mix. That's one of the first things to go. Second is usually bone health, because sex hormones produced by the reproductive system directly affect your bone health. And third is your GI system. And one of those reasons is because what the GI system will start to do is basically be a selfless mother. It'll be well, I'm not going to take care of myself because I'm going to do my best to keep this host alive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slow down digestion. I'm going to stop making stuff I need to properly digest as many things. And I'm going to try to absorb just as much as possible out of what the host is giving me food wise. And I'm just not going to take care of myself a lot in the process. we really need abundance. We need a lot of materials to keep that GI system running really, really well. It's doing its own GI self-care, so that it can also take care of the rest of our systems for us by digesting and absorbing food properly. So a couple things to get into the weeds, because I know this is helpful when I do this for you guys. A couple things that essentially happen when we're underfueled chronically, we're not getting the materials we need to make certain things. One of the first things that can happen is we stop making enough stomach acid. A lot of the time, symptoms that can come with this are reflux, which you may think, isn't reflux from too much stomach acid? No, usually it's from too low stomach acid, and using antacids to fix it is a huge issue in the space that I help people with all the time. Um, Low stomach acid can cause reflux symptoms. It can cause poor digestion, especially protein rich foods can just sit really heavy. Maybe you never tolerate protein shakes, that kind of thing. It can also look like bloating. It can look like stomach pain, abdominal pain with eating, especially more acidic foods. Maybe you've got some ulcer symptoms. And our stomach acid is so important. It's one of our very first barriers of defense when it comes to bacteria and unfriendly bodies coming in from the outside. No matter how much you wash your food, or are diligent about foodborne illness, bacteria comes in on our food all the time. We live in a bacteria rich environment. A lot of it's good for us, and the bad stuff should be getting killed by your stomach acid because it can't grow in an acidic environment. When you don't make enough stomach acid, you can imagine this becomes a problem because it means stuff that usually would get killed can start to grow where it's not supposed to. We can see H. pylori infections in the upper GI system. We can see small intestinal bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine. We can see dysbiosis, or just basically like an imbalance of good versus bad bacteria, undergrowth of good bacteria, overgrowth of bad bacteria. It's putting it very simply. In the large intestine, we can see yeast overgrowth, like candida. We can see parasite infections from, again, maybe you do a lot of open water swimming, maybe you have pets, maybe some parasites came in on your food and they just didn't get killed in the stomach acid like they usually would. And just makes you more susceptible to infection and all of this stuff. And as you can imagine, once all of that stuff starts to happen, you're going to get more symptoms from those things too. So that's a problem. So if you're listening to this and you're someone who's like, yeah, I've been treated for H. pylori or SIBO or candida like a bazillion times and it keeps coming back. It's not that the treatment didn't work necessarily. Sometimes that's the case, but it's that we didn't address the root cause of why that infection's there in the first place. And conventional medicine's really not good at this. They're actually not great at identifying those infections in the first place, in my experience. Some physicians definitely are. Some practices are more holistic than others and don't just do like colonoscopies to diagnose gut health issues, but we don't always do a great job at addressing the root cause. If we're underfueling chronically, or we're so stressed, this is another one that I'll talk about later, that we're not making enough stomach acid, because that's something that will happen with chronic stress. High intensity training being a chronic stressor for a lot of people, among other things, then yeah, your barriers are down. So as soon as you stop the treatment, if you're in the same environment, it's going to keep coming back. Stomach acid also helps us absorb vitamin B12 and protein and a lot of other things. So if you're, supplementing with vitamin B12, or you eat animal rich foods, or vitamin B12 rich foods in the form of animal products, because that's where they are primarily found, and you're like, I always have low B12 on my labs, that's a sign that our absorption's not great, and we need to work on that and address why that's happening. So essentially, we really want to, look at chronic underfueling, because this can really happen so easily. I know that this is something that I talk about ad nauseum all the time, but this is how this can start to affect our gut health. Another way is that if we're chronically underfueling, especially if we're not eating enough carbohydrates, because prebiotic fiber, which is food for probiotic bacteria, often comes from carbohydrates. We're essentially also just not giving the good guys, the good bacteria in our gut, the food they need to survive. And this can also contribute to undergrowth patterns and dysbiosis, because then you get an overgrowth of the bad guys and an undergrowth of the good guys. And when the good guys are undergrown, they do so much for us. They help us absorb nutrients. They produce a lot of beneficial stuff. I'm just going to throw that out there, but things like butyrate that can really help with the maintenance and the health of our GI lining. So kind of like that self-care of the GI system. Part of what helps with that is keeping the good bacteria super healthy and well fed so that they continue to grow and they continue to produce the byproducts when they're digesting food to help with the repair process of the good gut lining. And that's really, really important too. So with chronic underfueling, a lot of the times if you're someone who maybe you take a probiotic and you notice that your GI health doesn't really change when you take a probiotic, maybe it improves a little bit, but maybe it doesn't really change. The probiotic can be helpful, but if you're not giving those good guys what they need to survive, it's not really going to be that beneficial. So again, addressing the root cause and thinking outside the box there. Clinical Pearl, if you take a probiotic supplement or with probiotic rich foods like yogurt, kombucha, etc., you notice a increase in symptoms and like it does not get tolerated well, that can typically be a sign that there's some bad guys also overgrowing and you're just adding more bacteria to the party and they're producing gas and symptoms and all kinds of stuff. So we need to address the root cause of why that's there first before addressing the good gut bacteria. So just like a temperature check, how are we doing? This is what we do in practice. And a lot of the times, again, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses. We know that at least half of endurance athletes have a hard time fueling adequately because it's hard. And there's a lot of things working against you to do so. We exercise a lot. It's a stressor. It can blunt our appetite. It also raises our energy needs. It can be hard. Maybe there's also an eating disorder, history, disordered eating voice present, and you're struggling with your own inner dialogue or social media dialogue, external dialogue that's not helping you want to eat more. Maybe you're struggling with the fear of weight gain, preventing you from eating more. There's a lot of things that can make us not eat enough as endurance athletes, and it really does affect the body systemically. Your GI health being one of those things that takes a hit eventually over time. And it's really tricky when this happens because it can make you want to restrict food more because you heard maybe it's dairy, maybe it's gluten, maybe it's FODMAPs, maybe it's blah, 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 blah ingredient. Maybe it's seed oils. And that's why my gut health is ruined all of a sudden as an adult. Or maybe it's never been great, even as a kid. So you try cutting those things out. Maybe you do a food sensitivity test by like Everlywell, which I don't recommend, but I know a lot of people do them because they're not evidence-based at all and they're confusing and harmful. But maybe you do a food sensitivity test and it tells you that you're sensitive to like 20 different foods. So then you cut out some of those foods. Maybe you were given like a FODMAP handout by a GI doctor office and told, good luck, this is your diet now to starve the bad bacteria that are overgrowing or because these foods are bad or whatever the messaging is. And you restrict more, you underfuel more because it gets harder to eat enough when you don't have confidence eating a variety of foods, and it makes the problem worse over time. Maybe initially some symptoms get better, but usually it escalates and gets worse and snowballs over time. I know because I work with so many of these people who come to me with a food list of like 5 foods that feel safe to them and they feel so restricted by this and they still have symptoms, and now they also have maybe even more psychological symptoms just because they are feeling so restricted, and this is not good for us over time. One reason why these food sensitivities can develop is because when our gut lining is not being taken care of and our gut microbiome is suffering, whether it's because of overgrowth, undergrowth, both things, candida infections, H. pylori, whatever it is, when it is suffering, something that can start to happen is called intestinal permeability. This is kind of like this is the medical term, intestinal permeability. The term that's kind of like been coined by social media and people are running with it, that's not as scientifically backed, is called leaky gut. Our gut's supposed to be a little bit leaky. Stuff is supposed to get through the intestinal lining. That's how we like absorb nutrients into our bloodstream. But when our tissues are not healing well because they're not getting the repair, the TLC that they need, just like our muscles need, you're essentially like, oh, my gut is, more sore or it's not recovering well, just like a bicep or a quad, if you're not eating enough, or if you're not giving it enough rest between activity. If your GI system is struggling to repair itself, those tight junctures, those holes essentially can become a little bit bigger. There can become more of them. Again, I'm putting this very simply. This is not totally scientifically accurate, but just to help you visualize the metaphor. Essentially, stuff can start getting through that barrier that's not supposed to, like gluten, like other allergens, and then they're in your bloodstream, which they're not supposed to be there, and your body starts to react to them. And that is why when I do have people with, lactose intolerance, gluten intolerances, random allergies that cropped up later in life or after they had a virus or something like that, my question is always, well, why and how? Can we figure that out? Can we take a look at the GI health and try to improve it so that one, maybe this is reversed, which I've seen happen with a lot of people, especially lactose intolerance and gluten intolerance, not celiac disease. That's different. That's autoimmune. You have to be gluten-free once you are diagnosed with celiac disease. But with gluten sensitivity, food sensitivities, you can't have FODMAPs, those types of things. I almost always see people be able to add these things back in and have no symptoms or less symptoms because we have healed the GI tract so that the stuff's not leaking through, so to speak, and you're not reacting to it anymore. What a joy, right? With allergies, this is also a little bit different, a bit more autoimmune. Sometimes I see the threshold tolerance improve. So maybe we were anaphylactic before and we are not anymore. We just get, an upset stomach. But this is definitely trickier too. And I'd put it in the same category as celiac disease. And we want to work with an allergist, if that's the case. But anyway, this is why it's really important to eat enough. And when we do start to go down the rabbit hole of, oh, maybe it's this food or maybe it's that, it's probably not any food. Like it is. Your symptoms are real after eating certain foods, but that's not the root cause. We need to address the root cause. And then maybe the goal is to get that food back into your diet without symptoms. All right. Chronic stress. So this is another one that I see contributing to GI symptoms in my clients, in endurance athletes in general. Look, a lot of the people that I'm talking to are high achievers, perfectionist, type A. This sport attracts a certain type of person, maybe a couple different types of people, but I know that the ones who tend to underfuel and also do this sport, who are in that at least 50% who tend to underfuel, like you guys are doing so much. You are so damn impressive. Like I look at my clients and I look at, those of you reaching out to me and like, I would put myself in this category too, but like you're reaching out to me and I'm blown away by what you're doing and what you're carrying and what your goals are and what you enjoy and like what you do in a 24-hour day. Like you do a lot. You like to do a lot. It brings you joy to do a lot. You're good at doing a lot. You're not maybe as good at sitting around. Does that sound familiar? It does. I'm talking into a mirror right now. But stress is stress. And when we are, using exercise as a therapeutic tool to manage mental health because it brings us joy, maybe it's to take care of our health because we love it and we have goals and we're competitive with ourselves, because it's something that adds to our day. That's great. That's fantastic. And when we're talking about extreme amounts of exercise, and I would consider extreme probably anything over like 3 hours a week, which is pretty much probably everyone listening to this podcast, that's stress on the body, right? Like we have to make sure we're recovering from that. And we probably have to try a little bit harder than someone who is doing, 30-minute walks every day or, a couple workouts a week. Running in general is a high intensity exercise, even if it's quote unquote just your easy run and it's like an easy run. big air quotes around easy run, that's still considered high intensity exercise. So, when we're training for stuff, when we're running, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 miles a week, that's a lot of high intensity exercise. That is an extreme amount of exercise. I think a lot of the times our idea of what's an extreme amount of exercise gets skewed when you've done a lot of exercise. So I always like to ground people and bring them back down to earth and tell them they're doing a lot of exercise. If you're probably listening to this podcast, and that just means that we gotta give that central nervous system some TLC because we're putting it through a lot, and a lot of it is positive. There's a such thing as good stress. It's called eustress. There's also such thing as bad stress, which is called distress. And even if we are doing a ton of eustress and we're just not recovering from it well because we're under fueling, or there's also a lot of distress and our bucket's overflowing, this is when we can run into trouble. So when it comes to taking care of the central nervous system, this is why it's an important thing when it comes to GI health. So one, your enteric nervous system, which is the nervous system along your GI tract, is directly connected to your central nervous system and your brain. So when one thing is chatty or off or not doing so great, it's going to typically affect the other end of the highway. Essentially, it's a two-way street. When you are someone who maybe has a mental health diagnosis or you struggle with your mental health for whatever reason, you have anxiety, you have depression, you have ADHD, you have OCD, you have bipolar disorder, you name it. Okay, when those symptoms are maybe acting up more, you're triggered by something in your life, you're just having a hard time, whatever the reason is that we don't necessarily even need to know about, it's just, I'm feeling more triggered right now. That can directly affect our enteric nervous system because they talk to each other. So it can essentially jazz things up for your GI tract. This is one of the reasons why one of a really good therapeutic tool and treatment strategy for IBS specifically is incorporating cognitive behavioral therapy. Because if we treat one side of the central nervous system, a lot of the times the other side of the central nervous system, the enteric nervous system, will also respond well. So we want to make sure that we are taking care of our mental health, and that running, while a great therapeutic tool, awesome therapeutic tool, lots of evidence to back that up, we want to make sure running and exercise are not our only tool when it comes to managing our mental health, because it is a stressor on the body to run a lot. So we want to make sure we can recover from that and have other therapeutic tools to use when we're not running, because we can't just run all the time. When we're injured, different parts of your life, when things are just more stressful and you're struggling a little bit more, we want to make sure we've got more than just running as a therapeutic tool. We want to make sure that we're giving ourselves adequate recovery between training during like the day and week, and also during bigger seasons. We want to make sure that we're really honoring the fact that we do need to take time off after a goal race, even if it didn't go well. And also, even if it did go well, we also need to take off seasons that are longer than just a couple weeks. We need to balance our stress load so that if we're really busy and there's a lot going on in our personal life, in our career, whatever it is, we are still showing up for ourselves in those other ways, but maybe it's not the time to sign up for a marathon and go all in on something if it's going to tip the scales too far in the other direction. This can start to trigger GI issues because, again, that two-way street's talking to itself. Another thing is when we are in fight or flight mode. So when we're running, when we're exercising, we're in fight or flight mode. Okay. We're literally running. Fight or flight mode is like running from a bear. So even if you're just like running, but it's not from a bear, it's just like for fun, around your neighborhood, and hopefully you don't encounter any bears. This is fight or flight mode still. It's a lesser extreme, but you still got adrenaline, you still got those fight or flight mode hormones running through your body, and rest and digest mode cannot really be activated at the same time as fight or flight mode. This is one reason why fueling during your run is kind of hard sometimes. It's something you have to train, because you can't just turn off fight or flight mode and turn on rest and digest mode unless you're going to like just sit on the side of the road for a couple minutes and hope that you digest that gel. So blood gets shunted away from our GI tract when we are in fight or flight mode, because it's supposed to go to our muscles, our brain, the things that are going to require us to run away from the bear or just run around the neighborhood. Okay. So when that nutrient rich blood that's got all the stuff our GI tract really needs to repair itself gets shunted away from it during the exercise, and then also research shows for several hours, usually after the long bout of exercise, if it was a longer bout of exercise, like over 30 minutes, that's a long time for blood to be shunted away from the GI tract and for the GI tract to be bouncing around on the run and, not really getting what it needs to repair itself during those many hours of the day. This is called ischemia, or blood shunting. So this is another reason why, if we're in fight or flight mode because we're training for, a race, or we're just running these longer distances often, and we're stopping the run and we're kind of diving headfirst into life, and we're not sitting down to eat, and we're under fueling, and we're stressed at work, and we're running around like a chicken with our head cut off all the time. We have a hard time relaxing. This is not good for us over time. There is going to be a wall that you hit eventually. Trust me. Ask me how I know. But it's something that I just want to bring up because it's a very common issue that I see in endurance athletes. And I think it's because of the exercise habits themselves putting us in fight or flight mode for long periods of time, and how this can affect the GI tract. I also think it has to do with the type of person that is attracted to this sport. They also tend to be go, 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 do all the things, achieve, really hard on self, perfectionist, take care of everyone type of people. And when you're doing all of that all the time, yeah, your gut's just not getting a ton of TLC unless you're being extra super intentional about it, which within itself can be stressful. You can only do so much at one time. Sometimes we need to take periods of time in our life to focus on certain issues versus others. I've seen this over time too, like when we have, poor blood flow to the gut, under fueling, not giving us the things we need to take care of our gut. Maybe there's some dehydration in there too, to kind of talk about the three causes I talked about so far. When this becomes like chronic, this is a long-term issue. This is where too I can see, this can trigger like autoimmune conditions. And this isn't just me. This is also what research shows. This can trigger autoimmune conditions. So this is really something that I don't take lightly, because it's something that like snowballs over time, and you're like, I'm fine. I'm getting away with it. And then all of a sudden you stop getting away with it, and it sucks. So you're not doomed if this happens to you, if this is part of your journey, but it is a call to pause and take a look at how we may have gotten here, and try to pivot a little bit and support yourself and give yourself that TLC that your body's been asking for to move forward, so you can keep living the amazing, awesome life and achieving and doing the things that you want to do, but maybe with a bit more support, maybe with a bit more food on board, maybe with a bit more off seasons between races, maybe with a different approach to training and these types of things. Maybe with some more tools to manage your mental health other than just exercise alone. Okay. Another temperature check. How we doing? So I've talked about a lot of different causes that I see in runners for GI issues. Now, a lot of my clients, have come to me with the experience of, yeah, I've been to GI doctors, I've gotten colonoscopies, endoscopies, I've done stool tests, we've ruled out XYZ. I was told I have IBS, maybe try the low FODMAP diet, maybe get rid of gluten and dairy, maybe, just take some fiber gummies and Miralax forever. And yeah, it's just like still not helping, or these things don't feel like a good option for me. And there's not much support that's been given. If this sounds familiar, I hear this at least like once a week, from someone, and you're not alone. This is just kind of what happens a lot in the conventional healthcare system. And it's not because like GI doctors are bad. It's because they're trained to kind of look at the scans, find the really sinister stuff that needs to be addressed, like the colon cancer, the polyps, the bleeding, the diverticulitis, the IBD, the Crohn's, the celiac disease, although sometimes that gets missed. But, they're trained to kind of find stuff in that way. And if they're doing stool tests, maybe they're culturing for foodborne illnesses, parasites, some of the big ones that can be, again, the sinister things that are causing some issues. Because on a scale of population, you're probably still a relatively higher functioning person that they're working with compared to their norm. It's not their fault. It's just that's not what their role is. So when it comes to, if that's you, or maybe you haven't quite gone down that many paths yet, and you're like, when I hear hoofbeats, I want to think of horses and not unicorns or zebras, like maybe I should meet with a dietitian who is trained in this to make sure that I'm covering my basics here based off of what we talk about today. So how I help people assess for these things is typically we'll meet, or I'll email you or message you through the DMs just to get a little bit of your story. Like, what are your symptoms? What have you tried? What interventions have worked, which have not worked? What like is the timeline we're working with? Tell me some of that background so I know what my role is going to be and where I can come in if applicable. And if that's the case and we have an appointment, I'm going over your food intake, what's typical for you, what patterns have been really consistent, or what maybe you've changed recently. If there's been changes in your health or things that were diagnosed forever ago or things that happened forever ago that you didn't know if they were relevant or not to this. I can kind of ask these questions to get a lot of information and understanding of the big picture. That is just not really going to happen in conventional healthcare, even sometimes with insurance-based dietitians, because the time and the coding just doesn't, the math doesn't math, essentially, which is one reason why I like being in private practice with a little bit more freedom. So we're going to assess that. And if I'm like, yeah, there's some stuff we need to fill in some gaps, there are some things we can improve that are the low-hanging fruits, relatively speaking, we're going to start there. But if there's red flags, if I'm like, yeah, nutritionally, I think you're doing a great job. I don't have like a ton to say unless I'm being really picky, or there's red flags in your history or in other tests you've done with other people or other tests you haven't done with other people, and I have suspicions, then I may ask you to do a couple things. I may ask you to do blood work. I may ask you to do a stool test, but more of a comprehensive, holistic, really, really sensitive and really, really thorough compared to what's typically used in an insurance model, that I have really good results and success with people that I've done myself. So I may ask you to do these things, and this can kind of help us assess, one, how's your digestive function? How is the TLC going with the gut? Like, is it doing its self-care well, or is it not doing a good job and it's being a selfless mother and it's just trying to hold on for dear life, but it needs some help? I can see, are there unfriendly bacteria that are getting a little bit too rambunctious? Are there not enough of the good guys? Are the good guys overgrowing? Is the stomach acid low? Are there other nasty infections that, shouldn't be there? And it can really help me understand where to start from a intervention perspective. So that's kind of how I roll. And if there's like, again, additional red flags or things that I'm like, or things that come back on the stool test, like if we get, occult blood in the stool, or if there's really high calprotectin, or if there are some bugs that, we can't get rid of through holistic natural means. Of course, yeah, we're roping in GI doc. We're getting the colonoscopy, the endoscopy. We're getting the barium swallow. We're doing the things that we need to do to make sure you're covered from a lot of different angles. So that is how I help people. That is what it is like to work with me on these things. And there are literally so many tools we can use. So sometimes it is, yeah, like kind of starting where I think makes sense and pivoting if we need to. And I always want to reassess and retest and revisit how things are going. If, our interventions are not working well, or maybe they're working great, but we want to make sure they're going to keep working great, weaning you off of certain things, if possible, adding foods back into your diet. I am not someone to restrict people's diets, food groups, unless it is medically necessary, because again, I find this has more risk than benefit. And that's not just me. That is also newer research on things like FODMAPs. So Hopefully that's helpful. A couple clinical pearls for those listening, whether you are a like potential client, more consumer of my content, and or maybe you're a practitioner listening to this, looking for some tips. I've invested tens of thousands of dollars in extra education on top of my master's and on top of my undergrad and on top of my internship, trying to help people and try to learn more about this because I think our education does a decent job starting to help people with this and starting to help us understand how to help people, but it doesn't do a great job with when it doesn't work or when it's more complicated. So I want to get into some of these things.